Welcome to the Beyond Barriers podcast. If you're an ambitious woman who wants to dominate your career, then you are in the right place. This podcast is co-hosted by Nikki Barua, digital innovator, serial entrepreneur, author, and speaker, and Monica Marquez, ex-Googler, diversity expert, and senior corporate leader. From inspiring stories to cutting-edge strategies, you'll learn how to develop the skill set, mindset, and tool set to get future-ready fast and accelerate your success. Hi, I'm Monica, your host for today's episode. Did you know that white women are one of the most influential demographics in America? They are the largest voting bloc with purchasing power that exceeds any other demographic. And when they unify to demand change, they are a force to be reckoned with. So many sit idly on the sidelines, opting raising their hands to do, learn, and engage in ways that could make a difference. Why? Well, in this episode, Jenna Arnold, the national organizer for the historic 2017 Women's March and author of Raising Our Hands, shares the research and insights she gathered over the past few years crisscrossing the U.S. in conversations with white women about their identity and role in the country. Jenna peels back the history that's been kept out of textbooks and the cultural norms that are holding them back so white women can finally start really listening to marginalized voices and doing their part to promote progress. Raising Our Hands is Jenna's call to action for white women to stop avoiding the hard conversations, start accepting responsibility, and find a place on the new front lines. Jenna Arnold is listed as one of Oprah's 100 awakened leaders who are using their voices and talent to elevate humanity because she doesn't have much patience for the status quo. She has been called a disruptor in every industry in which she has dabbled, from elementary school classrooms to the halls of the United Nations, MTV, and the White House. For her recent work as one of the organizers of the Women's March, Jenna was recognized with a Glamour Women of the Year award. She has been recognized for shaking up long-standing assumptions and being one of the biggest ideas in social change, and named one of Inc. magazine's 35 Under 35 list. Visit IamBeyondBarriers.com, where you'll find show notes and links to all the resources referenced in this episode, including the best way to get in touch with Jenna. Hi, Jenna. Welcome to the Beyond Barriers podcast. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on our show. I know that our listeners are super excited to hear from you and all of the happenings since, you've been really busy since you kind of helped organize the women's launch and everything you've done since then. And you have a new book coming out. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I want to just dive right into you telling us your story, what you've been doing. How has your journey been since, all of the amazing work you did with the Women's March, and what's going on during the pandemic?
Well, thanks for having me, Monica. I'm really happy to be here. So where should I start? I mean, I think I'd probably answer that question very differently 8 weeks ago than I'm answering it today. And yeah, we are looking at a very different world in a way that I think can be very exciting if we approach it with the level of humility and grace that I think we all want to show up to our lives and our professions with, and certainly in ways that we want to be civic participants, and make sure that as we come through this, we take advantage of the opportunity to design a different tomorrow and a different system that benefits more people. So there's a lot going on.
That's amazing. So tell us a little bit about, in this current pandemic, we're having to do quite a bit of pivoting. Now, I know your book, you have a brand new book coming out that is actually exciting around the research that you've been doing these past couple of years. And it's called Raising Our Hands. And you had hoped to launch it, I think, pre-pandemic or probably around now, but you're now aiming for June. Tell us a little bit about your book and the really interesting research that you've been conducting around the state of American women. Would really love to hear some of those insights.
Yeah, so I have been traveling the country for the past 3 years, having closed door conversations with American women with a specific focus on the white American female demographic, asking existential questions related to power, privilege, proximity, a lot of discussions around what stereotypes about you are true, what are your biggest regrets, how has America showed up for you. My favorite one is, what are you willing to fight for besides your kids? And we've really been putting our identity and our capacity under the magnifying glass in ways that are particularly surprising to the people I've been doing the research with. And the reason I set off on this journey is, as you mentioned, I was one of the organizers of the Women's March in 2017. And when I stood on stage in Washington, D.C. and looked out at a crowd of millions of women, there were a lot of people wearing pink hats. I know you can all visualize it. And it also dawned on me that there were a tremendous amount, at least from, again, just a scan of the crowd, it looked like it was mostly white women wearing those pink hats.
Right.
And I sort of spent a little bit of time, a couple of weeks, with some behavioral scientists diving into the data around who was showing up, not just in Washington, D.C., but in any one of the 667 marches worldwide. What are those demographics? We didn't have the data catchment systems that I obviously would have loved to have in place.
Right.
Like, tell me what you care more about, climate change or repro rights, just so we can put you to work on those things. And it was a very haphazard way of bringing the world together, but it happened exactly as it was meant to. So I had a really hard time reconciling with how women were showing up on this one day, on the largest protest in human history, but then also what so many other women from this very specific demographic did on November 8th, 2016. And the reason I had a little bit of a front row seat to that is my mom is one of 9, and I have a huge family. We're about 60, 70 deep, and we're all very close. And there were many of my family members who didn't vote along the same political lines in 2016.
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time reconciling this idea of so many of my aunts who I love, who are responsible for raising me, who care about the world, who are, quote, I'm using quotes here, quote, well-intended women, also then pulled the lever for a candidate that didn't necessarily align with their best interests in decreasing the void in the gender pay gap, or making sure that their voices were as lifted as they could be, or any number of ways that felt like a vote for the current 45th president felt hypocritical to not only what was happening with the women in my intimate family who I love deeply, and then the millions of women that I saw on the street marching. And so I was like, something's just not adding up.
It's fascinating. Yes.
Reconcile the compassion, intention, and love, and what I'm seeing in front of me, and then also actions in the voting booth and with credit cards and things like that. So I set out to unpack all of that. And what I found was a country of, and I'm making, large generalizations here, but a country of brilliant, shrewd, creative, fierce women who are often sitting on the sidelines because of insecurity, a belief in self-worth, an inability to see their role in the comings and goings, and most importantly in the solution. I coined a lot of these phrases in the book, Raising Our Hand, around performance chores, performance myths, cognitive acrobatics, which came from a professor out at Stanford, Dr. Dr. Priya Field Singh, who came up with this concept that women do a really good job of doing backflips and cartwheels to convince themselves that the behavior of the men in their lives is just their unique husband, son, father-in-law, boss, or that I'll just, carry the additional emotional burden, labor, or the laboring in general of running households or raising children. That's how it's always been. So I found an extraordinarily powerful demographic. I would argue possibly one of the most powerful in the world.
Right.
White women are the largest voting bloc in the United States. They control 42% of the electorate. It will stay that way through 2060. And so in 2060, white women will still control 56 of the 100 Senate seats. They control $8 trillion of the $12 trillion economy. They decide the toothpaste, the religion, the cars, the universities, whatever it might be, just the life in general. And yet they're often bowing away. They don't understand that there's that level of power. And so the question that I pose in the book is, if you knew you had this power, and as we're seeing more clearly today than ever before in human history, this level of inequity that, again, going back to my well-intended loved ones who still pulled the lever differently than I did in 2016, they're not comfortable with the level of inequity that's in the world, but they also don't know that they have the power to do something about it. And sometimes that power is an allyship, as an accomplice. Sometimes that power is shutting up. Sometimes that power is screaming super out loud.
Right.
Whatever it is there's this huge layer of insecurity and ego that is getting in the way of this demographic showing up for all.
That is fascinating. And I admire your tenacity in wanting to unpack it, because I think there are many of us who were curious. I mean, like you, I have family members, I originally am from Texas. I went to New York City. I was in New York City the better part of, 2 decades, and then moved to LA. So I've always been in very progressive, areas. So my mindset and, just my views certainly changed because of the, just the frame of reference that I was able to experience as, I went into the corporate world and met lots of different people and whatnot. But they too voted differently than I did and was curious. So I admire the fact that you went after that and said, okay, I need to understand this and understand why, things are the way they are. So I'm curious. You mentioned that they have lots of insecurities or maybe self-limiting beliefs in really pursuing kind of maybe what they want or they desire. Did you unpack or understand what is driving those self-limiting beliefs? Is it, just more social upbringing, or just it is what it is, or, what is the root of that?
My hypothesis, which I lay out in chapter 2, is this, I call the Great American Pretending, which is this blueprint that we lay out for both women and men to very methodically follow throughout their lives. And it's almost like a game where you have to advance and get to the next level. And the game for women, and again, my life doesn't necessarily look like this blueprint, and some of your listeners might not have had this experience, but there might be some familiar characteristics. So in grade school, you are sporty and cute enough to have lots of friends. Middle and high school, you're popular enough to be able to choose whatever table you get to sit at. The cafeteria, you go off to undergrad, and your family back at home are asking questions related to whether or not you have a boyfriend before they're asking you about your passion of study. Again, those questions around finding a partner lead often the work that one should really be doing on themselves and their identity and their role in the world and their role with themselves and all the complicated human things that happen in the early 20s. If graduate, great, go move to a major city, that's awesome and cute, but you still, the big first huge task that you have to tackle is finding a partner to build some sort of life with. Assuming you found him, you're then asked questions quite quickly, like, when are you going to get engaged? Assuming you get that ring on your finger, you then spend the next 6 months or a year and a half talking about the wedding, DJ band, strapless or mermaid cut, whatever it might be. And then before you're done unwrapping the last wedding present, you're then asked what?
Family, right.
When are you going to have kids?
Right.
And then 3 months before you have your first kid, and that's assuming you can get pregnant, assuming you can conceive and carry a healthy pregnancy, 3 months before you have your first kid, you are asked the most privileged question of any demographic on the planet, which is what?
So 3 months before you have a child,
your first kid, you're asked the most privileged. You've climbed the Mount Everest summit. You checked off all of the to-dos on the blueprint, and you're asked this one final question, which is sort of, I envision, of like, you made it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what it is?
Curious. Yeah, I want to know what it is.
Are you going to continue to work or stay at home?
Well, I was thinking that, but in my mind, I'm like, when are you going to go back to work? But I'm like, that's not what they would be asking me.
So I'm not interested in the mommy wars. Like, let's put them in the 90s where they belong. But the fact that like that becomes the summit. That becomes the summit for the blueprint that we send so many women through, checking off all these different boxes. And I remember at one point with one of my best friends, she was like, I just feel like it's like, I have to get the boyfriend. And then once I get the boyfriend, I have to get engaged. And I always feel like the next level of happiness and clarity is going to be at the next step. And the same thing happens with men, right? There's a very clear pathway that men have to, there's a lane more or less that men have to follow too. And so I think one of the things that I took away from all of the research that I did for the book is that so many women are still stuck in that blueprint of like, if I worked, I have guilt. If I don't work, I have guilt, right? Again, I don't care what option you choose. You're just still handed a bucket of guilt to pour over your head for the next 30, 40 years.
Right.
And because there hasn't been, and it's happened over the past couple of decades, this massive push to be like, well, you can actually do both. You can raise children and have a healthy career and have a healthy at-home life. You can also not have children and not have a career. You can not have children and have a career. This idea that like there has to be certain milestones that we all have to check off. And I wonder if we've pushed ourselves further as just women in general to say, like, what's all encompassing? What does this all look like? So not only are we not opening up space for there to be new types of reality for the way that we live professionally, personally, in family units, as community members, but we also haven't then re-examined what the deliverable has to look like in each of those roles. So one of the things I heard from one of the listening circle participants, which is where I did all my research for the book, Raising Our Hands, was she said, our grandmothers fought so hard for us to have the right to vote and the right to work or to stay at home and to do all those things. But what she didn't do for us is she didn't lower the bar of what that had to look like. So you could work, but your house, your yard still had to be perfectly
landscape.
Your Thanksgiving dinner still had to be beautifully, your body still has to be fit in this one very specific shape. Your career has to look very much like this still. So this idea that like they just added a bunch of additional things for us on our to-do list and they kept the bar almost impossibly high. So what I found was this level of like, I know I'm qualified to do almost anything, right? And I think, that's my stance is like, I've been in so many different professional lanes throughout my career and they all look the same. It's like the same egos with the same territorial, battles with people. Nothing's ever been so jarring that I'm like, wow, this has never looked like, I've been in finance, I've been in production, I've worked in the nonprofit space, foreign policy. It's all the same sort of like power dynamics.
Right.
That are driven by ego, which is so heartbreaking. But nothing's like rocket science enough. I've never been in an OR conducting brain surgery, nor would I ever raise my hand to do that. Or have I ever landed a 747 plane. Like none of those things I've done. But like most of the stuff like we can all figure out. And I think women in general know that about themselves. But they don't know that they have so much wind blowing their sails in terms of their education, their freedom of movement for most women in the U.S., their freedom to be able to ask really difficult questions about what their salaries look like and how they may or may not be advancing. There's so many more, there's a lot more capacity for us to succeed, whatever that looks like on a one-to-one basis than we give ourselves credit for. So I always say women are holding the keys to the Aston Martin. I don't know, but like it's just when I Googled
it's a fancy car, yeah.
It's like a fancy, expensive car. The women are holding the keys to the Aston Martin, but they're asking whether or not they can drive. And what I'm saying is like, you have extraordinary power in the voting bloc as a consumer, as a professional, in HR departments. There was one listening circle that I did with all these top executives at Fortune 500 companies. And we were talking about, role power and roles and things like that. And, one of them was talking about how they were adjusting companies that every listener here is familiar with, said that they're adjusting their paternal leave policy. She felt like she was the only person who was showing up on behalf of like tens of thousands of employees saying, wow, actually, maybe it should look a little bit different. What is first caregiver? So just a quick bit of education. There was maternal and paternal leave, maternity leave and paternity leave, which is obviously it falls in the heteronormative category.
Right.
Now we say is first caregiver, second caregiver leave. And so this idea is, she was like, I feel like I'm asking the hardest questions. And fast forward a couple of hours, we were still talking about stuff. And at the end, which is the hypothesis of this book, is that you have the front lines of the work that we have to do to get to the country and world that we want is right there in the room with you. Like pull the front line of this work up to your tippy toes. And I said to her when we were wrapping up, I said, I just want you to know that you're standing on a front line with like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people standing behind you. You are like leading this huge battle for what I know feels like just like, well, should we give them 8 weeks or 12 weeks for maternity leave? But like, that is your front line. It's the work that none of us want to do on ourselves, with our companies, with our communities, and our relationships with our, brothers. And so anyway, it's this idea of like reminding women that they have the power, they have the capacity. Now more so than ever, their voices are heard, even though the people on the other side of the desk might be a little like curmudgeon-y about it. Like, oh, we really have to talk about maternity leave. Yeah, you do. And in those moments when you're like, I'm a little bit scared, I wrap up the book by saying, let's all be a little bit, I'm a little bit scared, but I'm also a little bit brave for you.
Right.
So go do that for all of us.
That's amazing. Now, I am curious, because how are the women reacting when you share with them, like when they get the realization that they do have the power? How are they reacting to that? Are they sitting with it and saying, okay, yes, I'm going to leverage this power? Or are they sitting back, like you said, and saying, I'm a little too scared to move forward?
Well, what chapter 2, again, in Raising Our Hands, is this idea of cognitive acrobatic performances where, you can say like, you're right, I'm going to go to HR and talk about maternity or paternity, or you're right, I'm going to, raise that as a gun owner, I'm still going to raise harder questions about gun control at the country club. And so you hear them say, you know what, I'm ready to do it. And, they put their hands on their hips and they're like, let's go. And then they will start saying, but you know what, that guy Peter won't actually listen to me. Or, you know what, I don't really understand gun show loopholes or background check policy. Or, I don't really know. Or I have to protect my salary, which is a very important concept of intentional invisibility, which I'll come to in a minute. But this idea of like, I'm just going to continue to do backflips to get myself out of doing the work that might remind us that we're not as smart as we know, as we believe we are, but we're scared the world's going to find out, right? Like this BS,
the whole fraudulent feelings, imposter syndrome.
Exactly. So I'm going to be discovered that I actually don't know what I'm talking about. And again, like I happen to believe that's the case for like a vast majority of humanity. Like everyone's just figuring it out. I've never been involved with a company where we don't say constantly, oh, let's just build the plane while flying it. Every single thing, every single initiative that I'm in. I mean, talk about the Women's March. As one, we were like, we picked a cross street, we picked a date, we picked a logo. And like, that plane actually just built itself, right? Like we just made sure that there was outhouses. I don't diminish what we actually did, but like this idea that like planes just build themselves sometimes if you just do the work and lean into it and say that you're going to raise your hand to try. But intentional invisibility is a symptom of women who are doing the work of laboring the 4 to 10 times harder than their male counterparts, even if their husbands are changing diapers. But this idea that, okay, I'm going to take the job that allows me to leave if one of the kids gets sick. I'm going to do bare minimum and a little bit more. I'm not going to ruffle feathers. I'm not going to ask hard questions about, I'm not going to ask hard questions to my boss that might potentially suggest that I'm in doubt of their decisions. I'm going to do anything I can to be a strong, invisible player. So they can't see the company without me, but I'm also not getting in the way. And being that, and so intentionally making oneself invisible is a role that so many women play, particularly if they're breadwinners, if they're households like mine, which rely on two incomes. This idea of like, what do I need to do to just be impressive enough that they can't quite justify a termination, that I can hold on to my job, but I'm never really going to ask the hard questions. It's also a hypothesis I have when it comes to government employees, where they are, the way that our government and our institutions are organized, that very hard for a very junior team member who might have a brilliant idea to get it up to the right ear. And because of the way, because of the incentives around, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. What's it called? Tenure. So like when there's institutions that have tenure structured,
right?
In my opinion, tenure is a silencing mechanism.
Right.
Silencing mechanism of people who probably have really good ideas about how things can be run better. And so the way that our organizations are structured, it prevents creative, new blood, dumb ideas, brilliant ideas from trickling up to places where they could be heard. But so many people in these large institutions are sitting in like the stance of intentionally being invisible, where like they're putting out the academic paper exactly, at the right cadence that they need to qualify for tenure, so that no one really notices and they can just lock things in for decades. When the truth is they're probably like, oh wait, we have to turn this department on its head, and they won't do it.
So they don't want to rock the boat, and they kind of just take the burnt toast.
Yeah, and oftentimes because, one, as we enter a new economy, which none of us know what this is going to look like over the next 10, 15 years, everyone put food on their table, myself being one of them. And so part of me that's like, just hold on to the dollar versus being authentic and speaking truth. My fear, and I recognize I'm sitting in a very privileged place of to be able to say this, is my fear is that if we don't run at that authenticity, if we don't speak up, if we don't raise our hand and say, hey, I think we're missing a huge opportunity here. In 15 years from now, when this is really just a dress rehearsal for a more deadly virus or something more catastrophic, World War III, like my big note, you asked your first question of that you sent over was, what have you learned on your journey? And my big note to your listeners is like, go now, speak now, tell them your idea right now. If you have an idea, launch it. It's all going to fly by so quickly. And the one thing, and this is like a little bit petty, but I think there's something grounded in it. I'm 23, though according to my license and birth certificate, it says I'm 38. And the one thing I've heard consistently from older women that I've worked with, research, is they will say things like, my biggest regret is that I didn't do more. My biggest regret is that I didn't chase my dreams harder. My biggest regret is da-da-da-da. And so my note has always been like, try, swing, like stack the bases to the extent that you can, and then swing as hard as you possibly can. And then if you miss and it doesn't work out, well, at least you tried.
Right.
The biggest fear of mine is getting to a point in my life where I didn't actually leap because it's just a missed opportunity. And then if I don't show up as the phenomenal violinist or the phenomenal chef or the phenomenal trainer or first grade teacher or whatever it is, I'm depriving the rest of my community and the country from my potential talent. And that's also like, screw you, step up. I'm waiting for you to be the amazing first grade teacher that my kid needs. So I think there's a level of like, my big note is like, go now, don't wait. And I will say from, taking a big step back from what is happening in the world today, there is a tectonic power dynamic shift that is happening worldwide. And I don't know if it's in the form of the sovereign nations that it's been for the past 100 years, or if it's a women, the marginalized, are finally have a roar that can penetrate broken and oppressive systems. When my uncle who voted for Trump said to me, what do you think about reparations? I was like, what?
Whoa.
Right? Like, okay, let's do that. So there's two options from my research that we have right now, or that I've been doing with the book, because I've been spending a lot of time with foreign policy experts around like what happens to countries pre-Civil War, et cetera. And when I was doing the research for the book, it was obviously pre-corona. They were like, yes, the United States is ripe for a civil war. We've become so divided. We are like crouched in our beliefs in ways that protect our ego. And then I just touched base with him 6 weeks into Corona, and he said, oh, no. This isn't about the United States potentially imploding. We are on the brink of a potential World War III. And what's happened is, when there is a movement of powers where it's shifting, it's going from one power entity to another. And I don't know what that other is, but in my head, I'd like to think that it's the marginalized populations.
Right.
That there's two things that either happen. One, humanity buckles down, pulls their bootstrap up, takes the lessons from history that we've all learned, and let's try not to have to learn them over and over again, apply them instantly and take that huge leap forward, or what we've seen happen in modern history, where in two occasions, the country has imploded, or the world has imploded into world wars. So what's happening with the power structures globally now is exactly what happened right before World War I and right before World War II. The difference, ladies, is that the quantity of nuclear weapons that we have on the planet today drastically different than what it looked like in World War II.
Yes.
If we take the path of, okay, let's fall into violence, let's fall into our wedge states, our divided mentality, both nationally and globally, it has the potential to be catastrophic.
Catastrophic, yes.
And I get to the point of like, oh no, our species depends on you speaking up to your boss, of you speaking up to your father-in-law, or you speaking up to your husband at at the Carrera sink when you're brushing your teeth at night. Like, our species depends on this power of you being part of the front lines of this power shift that's happening. I know I sure as hell need you to be there.
Yes, we need to stand up and stand out. Absolutely. So I'm fascinated by, I know that your research also, you focused on these honest conversations with, like you said, closed door conversations you were having. And you talk about some pretty, I would say, significant things around race, identity, privilege, and power. And, something that you said at the very beginning of, our discussion was that, when you looked out in the Women's March, and all the pink hats, you noticed that there was predominantly white women. And then there's the idea of the whole white privilege and how women, we need to make sure that we're, embracing and bringing all of our sisters, our women of color, and leveraging that privilege to also I would say, create awareness around some of those marginalized and those the challenges that maybe some of the women of color are dealing with as well. What did you find in those conversations? Because I know that, as a diversity and inclusion expert, when we bring up the topic of white privilege, there's a lot of sometimes defensiveness and people kind of, immediately stepping back and maybe not wanting to engage in the conversation.
Yeah, because if I admit that there's somebody else of a different race who's had a steeper hill to climb, then that means I have to admit that I've had it easier. And in me having it easier strips me of my uniqueness, of my entitlement, of my invincibility. Right? So this idea of like saying, well, I recognize that the world might not be as easy for other marginalized populations suggests that I then have to say, well, it might have been easier for me. And then it forces me to question whether or not the dollar that I earned was easier than the dollar that they earned. And then therefore I actually might, again, not be as smart as I always knew I was.
Wow, that is profoundly insightful. And I think, I thank you for that candid, and I do think that that's a lot of the core or the truth of, that it's what they're thinking, but they don't want to say.
Yeah. And I will say when it comes down to any, race, gender, and class and disability, whenever we have the conversation, I always say, as a white woman who has been in the social justice space my entire career, and I will be throughout the rest of my career, though I do have from maybe I can just invent a shoe that will make him I don't have to stress about money anymore. But my husband was like, forget it. Let's just forget you coming up with the perfect beach chair that doesn't rust. Just stay in the tree hugger space. So whenever I use language like that, I always say, as a white woman, I am first grade on these subjects, and I might graduate to second at some point in my lifetime. I have so much I have to learn, much that I have to undo. But first, before I can do that, I have to unpack it. And I'm unpacking it not just for my 23-year-old or 38-year-old life. I'm doing it on behalf of all of my ancestors too. I'm doing it as I'm diving into textbooks, as I'm having conversations with clergy. It is just such a behemoth to navigate. And so one of the things that I always invite women into when we start talking about these subjects is chill out. You're not going to have the answers to most of these things.
Right.
So just sit and listen and be a student. And if you don't get it, then ask a clarifying question, preferably to Google first, right? This was one of the things I did early, which was when someone said to me, I said something along the lines of, this might be familiar to you, I don't see color. And I waited for another year or two to ask a clarifying question to that one person, when the truth is I should have just hung out with Google for 30 seconds and been like, wait, is it true that I do or I don't? And all those answers would have been there.
Right.
So one, you're always a student on anything related to race, gender, class, disability, whether you're white or not.
Right. Absolutely. I will tell you right now, I've been put in my place so many times, even as a D&I expert for the past 20 years. Right. You're always learning something new, and you always realize that, I myself just committed a microaggression here, and always having to keep myself in check. So all of us are students in learning that. And, that minority tax of, well, you're Latina, you're a gay woman. What do you all think? And it's I can't speak for everybody else. I can only speak for myself, because if I do speak for everybody else, I'm going to put my foot in my mouth. So
that's right.
So that's absolutely. Right. Yeah.
So I think, so there is a level of agitation. If I say white privilege or white guilt, God forbid I use the term white supremacy, or patriarchy. But if you unpack how, this concept of white supremacy, which dates back thousands of years, but because I didn't have enough time, I only got to 1452, when Pope Nicholas V wrote a papal bull, which is the same thing as an executive order today, that essentially said, if you are white, Christian, and male, You have the freedom to go and take any land or people that aren't owned by other white Christian men. And so from 1452, that decree that was put on parchment paper, I have this very well visualized in my head. It was a scroll of some sort. They nailed it to some essentially said, white Christian men have the right to things before anybody else does. And that was like the foundation, part of the foundation for this idea of white being superior. And that's what Christopher Columbus brought over. That's what Dutch settlers brought over. That's what most of our ancestors brought over if they came from the European continent. And so this idea that I don't consider myself a white supremacist because that's like tiki torch holding protesters in Virginia. But I recognize that I live in a system that prioritizes whiteness as the supreme characteristic.
Right.
And so I found if you take language and be like, yeah, I'm not necessarily saying you're a racist. I can say with certainty that you have racial biases. I'm married to Jeremy Goldberg, and I have 2 children with the last name Goldberg, and my father was Jewish, and I consider myself Jewish, and I have anti-Semitic biases that I have to work on.
Right.
I can say I have biases against Hispanic people. I have biases against blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls who are wearing glasses. I have biases against people who live in Los Angeles versus New York. Like the list just goes on. And so stepping into the place of humility as a student, be like, I actually don't know what I don't know, and just stay there forever.
Yes.
And then when you mess up or you say something wrong, you say, I'm so sorry. How can I do better? And then stop talking.
Exactly. It's the 2-part apology. I tell people all the time, it's the 2-part apology. It is that simple.
It is that simple. But because we've been raised to follow the blueprint, part of the blueprint is getting, like, particularly for women, is getting good grades. You also have to get good grades on your debates with your boss, your debates with yourself, your conversations around gun control, and certainly in today's world, any conversations you might have about, privilege, race, and class disability. So so many people are like, let's not talk about that because I sure as hell don't know how to come to that conversation. I don't have the language for it, and I'm not going to perform perfection. So I'm just going to sit in silence. But what I found in my research is I took the white female demographic and then I diced it into lots of stereotypical groups. So it was like super wealthy Jewish women above the age of 55 outside of Cleveland to, middle income, evangelical, young moms out in Connecticut, right? So it was just, I really tried to get to the group think kind of concept.
Right.
And what I found is that they were all the conservative women, the women who fell on the conservative side of the political spectrum. If race, gender, and class came up, which I sort of forced it to come up, if it didn't come up immediately, I would force it a couple hours into Merlot and Brie cheese, is they would say, conservative women would be like, okay, I have a question I've never been able to ask anyone. I'm like, okay, great. Now's the time. Let's do this. And they would say, well, is it Black or African American? But then if you go to the progressive communities in like Brooklyn, and there's a lot of researchers who say progressive communities are extraordinarily dangerous for marginalized populations,
right?
Because they think that because they have friends representing religious, socioeconomic, racial creed, but that because they live in liberal communities or communities where lots of different types of people live, that they don't have any work to do on their biases. They would never ask me. Like the women in Brooklyn would never ask me, is it Black or African American?
Right.
And just for your listeners, just so you know, it's both. And again, revert back to the student and ask clarifying questions, but it's both. But this idea of like, well, I kind of sort of had that question too. But progressive communities would never ask that, and conservative communities were a little bit more quick to.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But I do want to make a point that, the whole white privilege isn't just for white women or white people. I mean, we all have some sort of privilege for, I will tell you right now, I absolutely, as a Latina woman, as a light-skinned Latina woman, have benefited from privilege, and yes, I've had to work really hard, and I'm first generational, graduate school, first generation, corporate, but at the same time, I've had privilege, even above some of my family members, right? So I think people need to realize that, we're not, it's not something that we're beating just a bunch of white people about, you have white privilege. It's you have to get down to the fact that maybe it's privilege. Maybe we need to get rid of the word white, but there are some, privileges that we all benefit from for various reasons, right? And like you said, it's based on the systemic biases, but we see it in the Latino community. We see it in the Black community, where the lighter your skin, a lot of the times it is, you benefit more, right? And if you look at, you can look at the Oscar winners, and you see a lot of the light-skinned individuals. So I think it's, one of those things where we need to remind people that, and be humble enough to say that, and check yourselves and say, what privilege am I benefiting from? Because there's something, there's sometimes is that where, we're looking at other people, or we're, immediately visualizing the, tall white male. But I'll be the first to admit that I too have benefited from privilege, just because of, because of the color of my skin.
Right. And so there's racial privilege, there's gender privilege, there's religious privilege,
yes,
there's nationality privilege. Like, I'm not really today, and this is for another conversation, but I spent a lot of time abroad, my teenage years and in my 20s, and just by being an American on foreign soil, I got treated differently, right? So like,
absolutely,
there's so many different advantages that we all have. The idea is to understand them,
yes, compartmentalize
them. In some cases, put them on a bookshelf. In some cases, use them. There is discussion around, like, do we shift the language from the word privilege to advantage?
Right.
And I think that's probably a worthwhile exercise to consider, because most people have levels of advantage. And I always say, like, we all just have different hands of cards, and use them and play them and put them to work. Is so key. What I would love to see today is more women stepping up in professional, personal, civic capacities. And I want to add that it's not just the personal and professional lane anymore. We must add the civic lane to that.
The civic lane, absolutely.
It's just about voting, calling your senator, marching, donating money. Yeah, do all those things. But civic lane is as much about what is your leave behind after your life? Like, what is it? How is your name?
What is that legacy?
What is that legacy? And so we all have a duty to each other and ourselves. And one of the things that's happening today is that some voices are being heard differently by people like me and people in my community, where they're pausing and listening in ways that they haven't for generations. And I just wonder, and this is like my hypothesis, and like hell if this isn't what's going to happen. Sorry, I really have to pull my curse words back a lot.
No, that's fine.
If we don't take advantage of the exact moment we're in, we are more connected to each other than we ever have in history. We are now in a position to look back at all of the brilliant, amazing things that humanity has accomplished, from medicine to understanding how our psyches work, to understanding how important it is to be in community. And we're also able to look back at all the horrific things that we have done to each other and say, never again, and take lessons. Like, slap them on your gold chain and say, and now I'm going to move forward to equalize things. Now I'm going to move forward and work on behalf of not just myself, but on behalf of on behalf of everybody. And that's not just how I vote, right? That's how I decide to donate my money. That's how I decide. Those are the consumer decisions I make, right? Like, it's not just, we talk about bottled water and Ziploc bags, but like, it's really about bottled water and Ziploc bags, ladies. Like, you have to stop that. You have to. It's much easier and convenient to be like, oh, I'm better at putting the kid to sleep than my husband, so I'll just do it. Or it's much easier to just grab this bottle of water because I don't feel like going to find that reusable bottle of water and who knows where the lid is type thing. Like, let's just get some of these small things together. Or in those moments when you're like, I don't want to fight with my brother anymore about politics. It's a little bit like, okay, well then think about how to have the conversation differently, because his vote in November could be the decision of life or death for people he'll never know and we'll never know.
Wow. Jenna, this has been the most fascinating conversation and inspirational conversation. And I will say my admiration for you and what you are doing to push this message forward is beyond describable. And please let us know how Beyond Barriers can partner with you and help you get this message across and really start pushing women to get engaged, that whole civic engagement, and have a voice and stand up and stand out and just, so that we can accelerate and level up together. It's just, it's what you're doing is phenomenal. And before, we close out this podcast, I want to make sure that our listeners, our women, know how they can get their book, how they can be, in contact with you, and how they can be of service, to your mission as well.
Sure.
So please share with us, how do we stay in contact and how do we get your book?
Well, you can buy Raising Our Hands. My name is Jenna Arnold. You can buy Raising Our Hands at your local bookstore. You all also know how you can buy Raising Our Hands very quickly on that little app you have on your phone too. So it's accessible in every place that you purchase items.
Right.
You please follow me on Instagram. My handle is @It's Jenna. My website is jennaarnold.com, JennaArnold.com. And I would really love to hear from people. I have a lot of learning that I personally have to do. And I've never been in conversation like this where someone hasn't been like, you might want to consider something. So if you have a note about anything that we discussed, please email me. Because I would like to then scale that lesson elsewhere. And my last note for listeners is that front line of the work that you have to do to better humanity is in that room with you. It is calling yourself up to your full potential. It is questioning the biases that you might have against yourself, against the rest of the world. And just know, in those moments of weakness, I am genuinely sitting here blowing wind in your sails. When you are scared, just know that I'm like standing behind you. And if you don't walk faster into that office or into that opportunity or onto that stage or into that difficult conversation, I will somehow come and push you through. And we're here. You're not alone. This is scary, but let's all be brave together.
Absolutely. Fantastic, Jenna. Thanks again for giving us the time and for giving us so much inspiration and the momentum to just go forward. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. There are thousands of podcasts out there, and we are so grateful that you've chosen to listen to ours. Visit IamBeyondBarriers.com, where you'll find show notes and links to all the resources referenced in this episode. And be sure to take the quiz on the website. Your score will tell you where you are, what helps you gain momentum, and what holds you back. You'll also get a free guide with cutting-edge career strategies. We'd also love to hear from you. Share your comments and topic suggestions on IamBeyondBarriers.com, and we'll be sure to address them in future episodes. If you enjoyed our show today, please subscribe and rate the podcast, or just tell a friend about it. See you next episode.